Is there a feeling in Lebanon that there could be war very soon because of this struggle?
I mean, the only country that geographically with whom we can have war is Israel, and it's always there. Since 2006, every year we have multitudes of articles saying when will the next war be. So people definitely are always worried. But just in relation to what was said before, I mean, obviously nobody would disagree that there's a wider struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But it is by no means a footnote to have a prime minister of a country being in a different country and whose whereabouts is unknown. So definitely it is an affront on Lebanese sovereignty. But of course, the big picture would not be complete if we don't say that, of course, the interference is not just from Saudi Arabia. We have interference from Iran, and we have interference from many countries in Lebanon's affairs. So, yes, the Lebanese public is worried about the escalation, but it seems that last week, with the crisis management, if we can call it, of President Aoun and all the leaders and all the political parties, there was a sort of a national unity seen. And this could be partly, just as was said by your guest before, that because Lebanon is so small, there was a realization that there has to be a unity, there shouldn't be escalation. Nobody, as I said to another media outlet, that there is no appetite for a civil war in Lebanon at the moment. And it seems like all the political parties have said we do not want to get drawn into a conflict between ourselves, and hopefully that there wouldn't be anything from Israel. And at the moment it seems to be going okay, but there's always the fear that there might be something at the borders, and that whether something is being cooked in the region for a new Israel-Hezbollah war, I do not know, to be honest.
I'm glad you mentioned Israel, because actually the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seemed to try and slow down some of the rhetoric and say, let's hold on here, we don't want to create a regional crisis. Fahad Nazer, this of course not happening in a vacuum in terms of Lebanon, in terms of Yemen. We have Crown Prince Salman going forward quite aggressively, some would say, with a reform program and also an anti-corruption drive. Is this a young leader determined to make a stamp not just on his kingdom but in the region, and backed by the United States and a very successful visit by Donald Trump, suddenly feeling that now is the time to assert their power in the region?
Well, I think that Saudi Arabia has indeed adopted a zero-tolerance policy when it comes to terrorism. It has gone after ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and its various affiliates inside the kingdom with a vengeance. It has arrested its followers by the hundreds, made sure that its funding has been cut off, and has also discredited its false narrative using both its religious institutions and the media. And I think that Saudi Arabia also feels that it's also about time that the international community starts to adopt a zero-tolerance policy towards Hezbollah and its Iranian supporters, both of whom have essentially played a very destructive role inside Lebanon, imposed their will on the rest of Lebanese society, and have also taken their very destructive militant activities and terrorist operations beyond Lebanon's border. It's not a coincidence that Iran finds itself in the position that it's in as the premier state sponsor of terrorism. This is the United States just issued its annual report on terrorism, and it declared Iran to be indeed, yet again, the premier state sponsor of terrorism. And it's also, I should also mention that Hezbollah is also considered as a terrorist organization by dozens of countries around the world.
There is so much finger-pointing in the Middle East when it comes to who is the terrorist nation and who isn't. But before I obviously get Professor Marandi to respond to that, I want to ask you, this is coming at a time when we've seen this big crackdown on corruption, as the Crown Prince is calling it, arrest of some very high-profile figures in the Saudi royal family. Is all this connected, or are they separate?
No, I think they are separate. But I think when it comes to the crackdown on corruption, I think there's very wide support on that inside Saudi Arabia. So, and I think the policy is very much consistent with the Vision 2030 that the Crown Prince has outlined for the future of the kingdom. And the vision has several pillars, including transparency, efficiency, and accountability. And these arrests certainly are very consistent with that. And frankly, I think they should be, I think they should be reassuring certainly to Saudi businessmen in general and women, but also to foreign investors, because some of them in the past have complained about a lack of transparency in doing business in Saudi Arabia. So that should alleviate some of these concerns going forward.
But one of the people arrested is one of the most well-known international businessmen ever to come out of Saudi Arabia, invests in American banks, has been seen as a sort of way forward, but he wasn't a big backer of the Crown Prince. So is this true, or...?
Well, what I've seen, I can only go by what has been released by the public prosecutor. And the details that he's released indicate that some 208 people have been questioned and 7 people have been released. They did not release the names. I think that if convictions are reached, that we will have more details, but I just don't have information as to exactly who was implicated in these arrests.
Okay, Mohammad Marandi in Shanghai. Obviously, Iran would think that is completely opposite, but I want to see your take on the reform movement in Saudi Arabia, the young crown prince. Is this a time where Tehran is thinking that Riyadh is upping its game in the region and asserting its strength?
No, I think it's the opposite. Iran sees Saudi Arabia as moving towards a black hole. The crown prince is so intolerant that he cannot even tolerate his own family. And it's a one-man show. There is no prosecutor. No one is ever going to go and invest in Saudi Arabia again when the princes themselves, who obviously have been stealing public money for decades, and the crown prince knows that quite well because he was a part of it. But no one is going to go into the country again to invest in future. And the Saudi Arabia is not the voice of the Arab people. The reason why it's failing on all fronts is that it's confronting nation after nation after nation, and it is leading itself to a dead end. And it's rapidly spending its cash reserves. And one major reason why it's carried out these extraordinary arrests is because probably they need the money, just like the fact that they wanted the Qatari reserves at their disposal because they've been wasting so much money on wars and starving people.
Okay, there's a lot of finger pointing both at Riyadh and Tehran in this show. Dr. Barrett, I'd just like to widen it out. How much of US policy is involved here? Because we saw that very sort of triumphant visit by US President Donald Trump to Riyadh and finger pointing straight away after the Qatari crisis blew up at the Qataris from the US president, which some in the region thought was sort of given a green light to Saudi Arabia. But then we just had Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, come out and give a very strong comment about Lebanon and not seeing a conflagration there. Is the US firmly on the Saudi side here, or are we looking at the US able to come in and broker something further down the road?
Well, obviously, the U.S. interests lie with the Arabs in the region and not with Iran. But let me say this. Yeah. The rhetoric on both sides really is counterproductive. I mean, what you have is you have both in Saudi Arabia and you have in Iran, for that matter, a patronage society. It's just the patronage flows in a different way. Let's talk about what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Really what you have here is you had a compact in the early 60s among a set of brothers and said, we're going to swap rule around and we're going to maintain this patronage system and we're going to have an agreement between us, consensus. We're at the end of that because now we're down to the next generation and they're literally hundreds of them. Yeah. And so what was always going to happen is always that the span of sharing political power was going to contract. And because you simply can't rotate it among a couple of hundred people. So what's happened is Salman bin Abdulaziz, the king, who was one of the Sudaris, has come in. He was always a reformer and a modernizer. He's come in and he said, okay, I'm going to put my faith in my son, Mohammed bin Salman, and we're going to narrow this base. So it's a dual thing. It's both a political consolidation and it is at some elements within the society have carried patronage beyond the point of patronage to the point of corruption. And so they're trying to clean that up. But I do think it's going to cause some instability as far as investment. I think people are really going to look because some of the people that have been arrested have very, very close ties, real solid business ties with the West, and Walid ibn Talal is one. And I think that is going to cause some second thoughts in the West about investment in Saudi Arabia. The political question about why exactly they acted now against figures that that were power centers, I think that's still up for grabs, and we'll see what happens.
Halim Shebaya in Lebanon, a small country is divided by this big power play. Lebanon could be the latest. Obviously, we've seen what's been happening in Yemen. We've seen what's happened in Syria. You could say Iraq too. Increasingly, the divisions seem deeper and wider and spreading across the greater Middle East. Could you see a Middle Eastern war between Riyadh and Tehran at some point soon?
I mean, honestly, I can't predict the future, but at this point, when I read or when I see the Saudi rhetoric, it's mainly threats against Lebanon. So it's said that Saudi Arabia has said that Lebanon has declared war on Saudi Arabia, which is something that did not take place. But what Saudi Arabia means is that it calls it now, it is the government of Hezbollah, because Hariri has now resigned, and so now Lebanon is, according to Saudi Arabia, dominated by Hezbollah. But I mean, at this point in Lebanon, Saad al-Hariri is still prime minister because the president has not accepted his resignation. Right. And even his political party, the Future Movement, is saying that the first priority is to get him back. And so basically at this point, we still have a government of national unity. Nobody in Lebanon has declared war on Saudi Arabia. But I think it's just a war of words. It's a psychological warfare on Lebanon, knowing that Lebanon is a very small country that can be deeply affected by Saudi escalation and Saudi sort of sanctions and blockade, similar to, or I don't know if blockade is the right word, but kind of a bit of more escalation, economic sanctions, embargo, economic sanctions. You know, you have a lot of Lebanese people, citizens who work in Saudi Arabia. If I'm not mistaken, I might be mistaken, but the number is over 300,000. So that's really the worry. What would they do to Lebanese citizens working in Saudi Arabia? These are the families of these 300,000 perhaps worrying about this. But as for war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, unless there is a really big decision backed by the U.S. and then for Israel and Saudi Arabia to attack Iran, that would be a completely different issue. But at the moment, I hope cooler heads will prevail. And I just heard now, just a half an hour before coming to the studio, that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had a very good statement on Lebanon, saying that they still consider Saad al-Hariri to be a strong ally, and they respect the stability and the sovereignty of Lebanon. So, I mean, obviously, we don't know what Trump will tweet or will say to negate what Rex Tillerson has said. But I think part of the war, the discussion on war, is a psychological warfare on Lebanese.
Fahad Nazer, not a hot war, but are we in a cold war between Iran and Saudi Arabia? And where does this end?
Right, so I think that the main trigger for the recent escalation in tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran has to do with Yemen. The Houthis launched a missile over Riyadh just over the weekend. And by all indications, including a statement that just came out from the U.S. CENTCOM spokesperson this morning, this was an Iranian-provided build supply.
The U.S. Air Force said it looked like an Iranian rocket.
Right, it had all the markings of Iran on the missile, and this was not the first time that such a missile has dropped on Saudi Arabia. And this is, frankly, a continuation of the legacy of Iran's policies in the region. This is what it has done for decades. Rather than support internationally recognized government of Yemen, it has chosen to support a militant group. Okay. Just as it has in Lebanon, it has chosen to support the Houthis, and this has led to a rather destabilization of the Yemeni conflict. It has not helped at all. And contrary to what one of the guests said, actually, Saudi Arabia is the top provider of humanitarian aid to Yemen, and again is supporting the internationally recognized government of Yemen, not a militant Houthi rebel group the way Iran.
Can I just make one quick comment?
Go on then.
I just want to say that it's very rich coming from your guest that the Saudis who are starving the people of Yemen and bombing them day and night, weddings and funerals and schools and hospitals, complain about a single missile, and then make reference to the Americans, and we know about Iraq and American intelligence and the lies that they made back then. The starvation of the people of Yemen is really shameful, and the U.S. support for it is even more shameful.
Mohammad Marandi, thank you very much. You're going to have to end the show there. The frustration, the finger-pointing continues, but that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.